Hello everybody, welcome to this online discussion on the subject of animal agriculture and the food system of the future, with the obvious backdrop of the climate and ecological emergency which we find ourselves in. My name's Richard and I'll be moderating this discussion today, which obviously means I'll be introducing the amazing panelists and asking them questions that have already been pre-submitted. So our first panelist is Amir Kassam, Professor in the School of Agriculture at the University of Reading, UK, member of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and who has just edited a book called Rethinking Food and Agriculture. Next we have Dawn Moncrief, who is founder of A Well-Fed World and board chair of ProVeg International and Beyond Carnism. We also have Nassim Nobari, founder of Seed the Commons, an organisation that works towards achieving sustainable and just food systems. Marco Springman, doctor and senior researcher in health, environmental and economic dimensions of the global food systems at the Oxford Martin Programme of Food for the Future at the University of Oxford. We have Alex Lockwood, doctor and researcher in critical animal studies and veganism at the University of Sunderland, UK, and one of the founder members of Animal Rebellion. And finally, Amir Kassam, visiting professor at Winchester University's Health and Wellbeing Research Group. She's also a consultant haematologist and honorary senior lecturer at King's College Hospital, London, and founder and director of Plant-Based Health Professionals. So thank you very much to all our panelists for coming, and we'll get straight on to the first question. It's quite a big one, and I'm going to direct it to Amir. So question number one, what is the impact of animal agriculture on nature? Is there any for-profit animal agriculture that is sustainable going forward?
I think the the impact on nature can be viewed through the impact on environment, which are massive in terms of destruction of biodiversity, in terms of land degradation, and of course pollution of our water systems, and of course global warming. I mean, these are a big set of inputs which are which are feeding into our current set of global crisis, which we now keep hearing about. There is another major impact, and that is on land use development or land use management. And that is a little more subliminal, subtle, because for example, this situation in the UK, more than 70% of our land, agricultural land in the UK, is used for animal production. But this is not a well-known fact. And behind that allocation is, of course, an economic system which basically has taken over this vast area of land, and a lot of it is used for entertainment and grouse shooting and so forth, rather than producing any real sustainable food for the society. So these are the kinds of impact, and of course the impact on nature are from both intensive animal agriculture as well as extensive animal agriculture. In terms of the intensive industrial agriculture, of course, one requires vast amount of livestock feed, for example, feed those animals, and we're not talking about small numbers of animals. If you look at land-based animals, we're killing off 70 billion land-based animals every year, and they require a huge amount of land to produce livestock feed. And of course, in the UK, a lot of that comes from outside Britain, like, for example, places in South America, especially Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and these are countries which of course are part of the Amazon region, and has led to a lot of destruction of forest vegetation. So these are the kinds of impact we're talking about, and in terms of extensive animal production, this so-called 70% of our area under livestock production, which means that most of that land is devoid of protecting vegetation. So what happens? We've got animals roaming around all the time. The surface of the ground is sealed. As soon as we have 1 inch of rainfall, we are waterlogged. And if you've got a bit more rainfall, we are flooded. And this causes a vast amount of damage in the lowland, avalanches, and of course bridges, roads, systems, and these are all we've seen them, and of course lots of homes get damaged. So these are the kinds of things which are coming out of intensive and extensive livestock production in terms of damaging our natural resources. And when those damages occur, of course, what happens is that our agro-ecosystems or ecosystems become dysfunctional. And so they are not producing the kinds of natural gifts which are given to society by nature. Just give you one example. For example, and I'll stop. In India, the dairy industry has managed to wipe out the total vulture population of India, and this comes out of the dairy industry, and of course the image is that India is a third world country, and now it doesn't have any intensive production of livestock, but their dairy cows are loaded with antibiotics, and of course these are then abandoned, and then of course they are scavenged by vultures, and the food chain is basically toxic, and this has led to further complication. Dogs have now taken over that job of scavenging, and so rabies has increased, and so you get lots of children being killed every year. So these are the kind of knock-on effect which are also present. Sorry, and there was the second part of your question. It's a slightly interesting question, because if you want sustainable and animal agriculture, I mean, in theory, if it is agriculture, that means we are now talking about managing animals for profit. Can they be sustainable? And to be sustainable, you have to be within a recovery rates of what nature can recover from, and you can convince yourself that at the low level of production where recovery is possible, we can have sustainable livestock production equivalent to what happens in nature, wildlife. But if it is supposed to be part of sustainable food system, then the answer is clearly, the answer is no, because you would be making a profit to feed into a food system which is then causes health issues, and of course there are other issues as well, and so I think it's. My feeling would be that you can have profitable animal agriculture, but you can't really convince people that it can be sustainable for a long time and not do any harm to nature or human beings.
Thank you, Amir. Would anyone else like to jump in, comment on that question?
I'll say a few words just to tag off on that. At a well-fed world, one of the things we're focusing on a lot is the deforestation, because it does provide something tangible for people to understand. We just created an eco-food guide, which anybody can download at ecofoodguide.org, which really breaks down the deforestation from feed and grazing. And so that's important, and not just in terms of the carbon that's released, but then the photosynthesis that's being lost. That is one of our only natural tools to pull greenhouse gases, pull carbon dioxide out of the air. So it's this double loss of releasing the carbon and then not being able to pull it out of the air, and trying to make those types of connections very clear. So in terms of sustainable, a lot what we're hearing now is about regenerative grazing and farming, which is being framed, it's now almost synonymous with livestock, even though it doesn't have to be. And the idea of soil carbon sequestration within the soil is the lead on a lot of that, but they're not talking about the methane. And so in terms of grazing, while it's not intensive and certainly better for the animals at the very immediate sense, not for the animals in terms of the climate impact, but the grazing releases 3 to 4 times the amount of methane into the air. And methane is, we use a 20-year time frame, so this is for people who are a little advanced. Most of the global warming potential is based on a 20-year time frame, which makes it much less. But even at a 20-year time frame, it's more than 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But at 100, that's at a 100-year time frame. But at a 20-year time frame, it's 84 to 86 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we really need to focus on methane. And then it matters, but it doesn't matter nearly as much if something within a small frame is a closed circuit and is seemingly sustainable, because you're still having the methane being released, causing all this immense damage, and again, at least triple when it's grazing. And so a lot of times what we see is in the lower income countries that they focus on the need for livestock in small circles, and that it's not causing the bigger damage supposedly. But if you say that, it doesn't mean you can carry that out to higher income countries. So while something may seem sustainable on a very small scale, but not profit driven, right? It has to be very small scale. Once you're talking profit and feeding the entire population at any type of amount, it's just not scalable. You have too much pollution per unit of land. You have too much methane, too much nitrous oxide. And so it just really isn't. It has to be minimized, ideally eliminated for best results.
Can I pop in there? Yeah, I think both of those discussion points are great. And I think, Dawn, what you mentioned is a very important one, the role of climate change that Amir hasn't really touched upon, right? I mean, if we look across the food system, we know that up to a third of food-related greenhouse gas, up to a third of all greenhouse gas emissions are related to the food system. And of that, roughly 3/4 are due to animal source foods. So animal agriculture is a major driver of climate change that we somehow have to grapple with. And I guess the question whether there is a way of making that sustainable or making a profit-driven system sustainable, those are two different issues, right? I mean, if you just look at greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to make those sustainable, you just need to have low greenhouse gas emissions, right? And there are limits of how you can accomplish that. And it probably requires a mix of changes in farming, changes in total production. So, for example, we have proposed one such limit by which there shouldn't be more than 1 serving of red meat that includes both beef and pork. So less than 1 serving of beef per person per week for everybody. That seems to be, according to our calculations, if you factor in technological changes, a limit that would be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement of having not global warming more than 2 degrees Celsius, but also in line with other planetary boundaries of water use, land use, and fertilizer application. Now, if you, and of course, one can discuss whether that is a good target or not. But if there is such a target, and such a target would probably always be a fairly low rate of, for example, beef production and also production of other animal source foods, then the question is, how do you allocate that production, right? And I guess there the sort of economic instruments really come in. If we know there is an upper limit, can we have something that is similar to an emissions trading system, but for agriculture, for example? Or do we just tax animal products such that we don't get above that limit? So, I mean, there are some instruments that one can think of that are still within the market economy, but they would heavily regulate any business that would operate within that. And I think a regulated market economy really could, could provide the way forward without dismantling everything, right? Just as a sort of maybe middle of the road perspective here.
Thank you very much, everybody. Did anyone else want to comment on that, or should we go over to the next question? Next question, right. Well, it's an ethics one directed towards Alex to start with. And that is, what ethical considerations are there when discussing animal agriculture in relation to nature as a whole, but then also animals and indeed other humans? So what are the considerations and what kind of framework should we be looking at?
Just a small question then. First of all, I think it's right to say that certainly for the majority of people watching this, and for those who have become involved in Animal Rebellion, and certainly for all of us who have found the sort of like parts of the team of Animal Rebellion, there is no just or ethical use of animals or exploitation of animals in any system. So if animals remain as property, it's an unjust system. Therefore, within the current sort of like legal structures that we have, both in the UK and internationally, the only ethical food system that we could have would be a fully plant-based food system, like removing the use and exploitation of animals from the entire system. That is the vision, and those are the demands of sort of Animal Rebellion, of a systemic change, like in the UK and globally. Of course, it's a simple thing to say, but it's a very complex situation. And one of the things that, certainly in the research that I've been doing, I've been interviewing lots of farmers and food producers and policymakers, is that we need to err to the side of complexity. If there are 200,000 farmers in the UK, we need 200,000 solutions to making a plant-based food system a reality. And in terms of ethics, then, the questions are like how are people treated in that system? How are animals treated in that system? And how is nature treated in that system? And people are not treated as property, and therefore, because if they were, everyone would think, it's a completely abhorrent idea. For those of us who have been active and advocating for animals, it is as abhorrent an idea to us as well that animals are treated as property. So ethically, the first step really has to be a shift away from viewing animals as property, however that might work, whether there be legislative, policy, ethical changes. And the third one being sort of how then do we ethically manage that in terms of the relationship with nature, and some of the issues that have already been covered in terms of land use, rewilding, the end of deforestation, the care of our oceans, etc. What's really interesting for me, and some of the big questions that I'll then hopefully have other people respond to and sort of put out to, is that in the long timeline of sort of human behaviour, if you look going back, say, like 10,000 years to the start of the agrarian age, the domestication of animals and the domestication of ourselves as well, in terms of moving from foraging nomadic human beings into sort of agrarian settled sedentary beings, was the need for property rights. And for control over areas of land and future benefits accruing from that land, that became central to the way that we organised our societies. If we were foragers, when the food ran out, the berries ran out in one place, we could move on. When we settled down into one place, we started to need to think about who owns what. And how then do we own things in the future? Because actually, if it's a bad crop this year, do we have enough reserves? People started making storage. All of these, conditions have led over the last 10,000 years to the society we have, which is about sort of control of property. animals were central to that. So animals are central to the way that we structure our societies today. So that actually ending the property ownership of animals, and particularly within animal agriculture, is the vexed question of society today. And it's obviously different in different societies, because actually in the UK, it wouldn't be too difficult for us compared to, say, some sub-Saharan African countries to move to a plant-based food system. I mean, work done by Helen Harwood and Matthew Hayek out of the Harvard School looked at the way that actually in the UK, we could be nutritionally sovereign, we could grow all of our own food here and get all of the benefits we need from it with using a third of the less of the land in a completely plant-based system, you know. But there's still a load of data and knowledge gaps still to be able to make that happen. But I think ethically, if we can look at the question of like, what would it look like for us? Well, how can we envision a future where animals are not property? That would completely change the food system to being a plant-based one, because you cannot, you know, if animals are not property and if they have their own sort of, whether it be rights or personhood or sort of rights to flourish, positive rights, then we would have to take them seriously. So for me, that ethical question is like, it's such a big one, it's really difficult to answer. And it's such a detailed one that there are so many nuances to this, like how are farmers treated and how are animals treated. One of the big things really is that farming is an identity, and we all have identities. And actually these farmers have grown up with these identities and feel proud of actually having fed the country, feel proud of responding to what they've been asked to do, which after the Second World War particularly was feed the country quickly with cheap food. And farmers have done that, and now very much they get told, well, actually what you did using pesticides and switching to massive algal crops have wrecked the economy, have wrecked the environment. So thank you, but yeah, you did a bad job. So farmers have to be central to any transition, and they have to be ethically central to that in terms of respecting and thinking of humans as animals too. You know, working out all sort of like the details and the sort of the questions and the policies that might get to that is like the big job of where we're at. So actually ethically, I think the most important thing we can do is start to ask questions about what we do want rather than what's gone wrong or what we don't want. And I think we're at that point now, because we have to make changes. We have to see things start to become new and changed and have a different way of doing agriculture. If agriculture is, and obviously is going to be a part of our future, how can we do that without animals within it? You know, and as Dawn mentioned actually earlier, sort of, you know, the regenerative agriculture sort of model doesn't have to have animals within it, or what it doesn't have to have animals as property within it. It doesn't have to have animal death within it. You know, so there's a lot of things we need to look at there. And so in a way, ethical questions now become really practical questions, because we have to figure out how to do this rather than whether it's right or wrong to do it.
Thank you very much. Nassim, you wanted to jump in there?
I was going to just add a little bit on following on what Alex was saying. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so I completely agree that that the way we treat animals, making non-human animals into property, the way we view our relationship to non-human animals is foundational to how we organize socially, to our economic system, to how we treat other humans at a societal level. And, you know, there's some interesting research that's come out recently. And first I'll say that there's often this idea that, you know, that with the development of civilization, so an agrarian society and then urbanization, that, you know, we created inequality, social inequality amongst people. We created a class society. And so a lot of people, especially who work on environmental issues or food system issues, have really the goal of moving away from that entirely. And so there's this notion that inherently an agriculture-based urban society is going to be an unequal, oppressive society. And what's interesting with some new research is that it compares urban areas in pre-Columbian North America with urban areas in the old world, and finds that in North America, there was actually much less social inequality despite the urbanization, pointing out that it's not, in fact, necessarily urbanization or the move to an agrarian society that's the only or even the main factor here. And so here, in comparing levels of inequality between the New World and the Old World in urban societies, they found that the key factor, the key difference was the domestication of animals. So I think that these things are really important to look at and see how, as Alex was saying, at this fundamental level, how we've decided to, to perceive and use these non-human animals has also impacted our own society and the inequality we've created. Having said that, I would, if we're animal liberationists who are speaking to other animal liberationists, I would really caution against, I guess, getting too excited with that information. I think that it is something that's really important to take into account when we're thinking about what's this new food system that we want to build. But I think that there's also a tendency in the animal rights world to sort of think, well, if we solve animal exploitation, we've solved everything. Everything will follow from there and we'll just have a just society. And that's not the case. The fact that 10,000 years ago, something was foundational to how we developed as a society doesn't mean that today, as an individual, if you're vegan, that you're not contributing to oppressive systems, or even if a society, if one country were to say, well, we're going to move to a plant-based system, it doesn't follow that the damage of how we've socialized for centuries is going to be undone. And I think that that's a trap that people get into, because often, often it can very much be the opposite. There are examples where, sort of veganism becomes a vehicle to sort of demonize an other who eats a certain way, who eats certain animals, and so on.
Yeah, can I come back to that just very quickly? Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I mean, as I've been looking at my research, and I was literally hoping, oh, brilliant, maybe we can go back to, like, looking in the far past for something that we've lost that we can go back to would be ideal as a way of holding it up and saying this is what we need to go back to. But whatever systems we've had, actually there's no system that we can go back to in which the animals, in the way that we currently structure society, could just be upturned if we remove a part of it. Which is why systems thinking is so important. Everything that we do now has to be done within these complex systems thinking to really identify sort of like how we've got to where we are. Yeah, great. But actually we're going to be moving forward and not backwards. And that's why it's so important to start visioning sort of like what we do. And which is why, Afrofuturism and science fiction and speculative fictions and projects like the Vegan America project started by Martin Rowe and Brighter Green, all thinking about what do we want, is going to be learning from all of that and actually creating something that actually we don't yet know, which is why, Afrofuturism and like the writings of like Adrienne Marie Brown and, Octavia Butler and all of that, those people are brilliant, because actually they're the ones who are starting to envision different ways of living that we haven't experienced in our past at all, and that for me is the way out.
Could I come in, Richard? Yeah. There is, of course, an ethical dimension which we all are concerned about, and that is the way we have treated animals in terms of animal genetics. I mean, today, a milk cow has to carry a huge udder. I mean, some cows actually would give you 10 gallons of milk a day. To carry an udder between your two legs of that weight is not a joke. And it just basically, that's why a cow hardly wants to stand, because it just is too tired to carry that churn. And the same, well, in fact, by the way, I mean, I must reveal, I used to be a cowman on a farm when I was a youngster, and I know what cows were going through. And same thing applies to the turkey, chicken. I mean, we've actually deformed them as well. It's not just abusing them when in confined spaces, but also their shapes are so warped now that they are not able to even live a normal life. So I think that's a very ethical question. A course, those things also apply to crop agriculture as well. Somebody mentioned regenerative agriculture. That's a very interesting term, especially when it comes to livestock, because it was degrading the environment so much, especially the land, that it has to be regenerated. And just because you have a little bit of better grazing management, a whole sort of notion of regenerative agriculture, where they are now trying to show how essential it is to have livestock, because there are other so-called advantages as well. But in crop agriculture, you don't need, and of course there's an argument that of course livestock makes agriculture sustainable. In crop agriculture, you don't need animals, and one of the main arguments is, oh, animals will provide you manure. Manure is just biomass passing through guts of livestock, and that can be done very nicely, as it has been done by earthworms and other mesofauna in the soil. But there is also a problem, a similar problem with crop agriculture, which is not the subject matter of this talk, but and that is the way we farm our crops, which again has been a very degrading agriculture. Now, of course, all these things we've learned in the last 50 years or so, and so that part also will need to change in terms of sustainable plant-based food system as well. Like tillage is a major root cause of land degradation, and it is basically removing land at the rate of 10 million hectares per year, or the size of Portugal, every year for the last 70 years. And again, like many other things, these things are not highlighted easily. Yeah.
So I'm so glad Amir brought that up. I wanted to tag in also, because there is this idea that animals are needed for fertilizer, if for nothing else, even if you weren't going to consume them directly. And so just to provide a counter to that. So I'm glad you brought it up. And on terms of ethics, just a lot of people are going to have trouble wrapping their minds around not having animals as property or treating animals in a more equal way. And so I'm very glad that there's a push for that. But for folks who aren't able to get there, there's still all the ethical reasons to be plant-based. So you don't have to, I hope people do, but if you don't, there's still the human cost, the environmental cost. And so on an ethical level, for all these reasons, you've got the case for plant-based food and farming. And there are models also out there for plant-based farming, veganic farming. Grow Green in the UK does a lot. And so I hope people look it up. If they're going to make the arguments for having to have animals, to really research it and not just kind of default to it as a way to defend meat consumption, which happens a lot. So a lot of times vegans are targeted as being sentimental, but it's actually a lot of science, a lot of research. We've got the numbers, and it's folks who are attached to meat and dairy and other animal sourced foods who really kind of bend over backwards to try to make the case for it when it's not there.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think we'll move on to the next question now, and I think it would be good to maybe focus on, I guess, the other big issue is health in related to agriculture, in related to eating plant-based diet. So the UK government at the moment is campaigning for people to lose weight and get active, but the billboards are everywhere, but there's not much talk about the type of food that we're consuming. So So wanted to ask Shireen, before it's opened up to everybody else, is plant-based food better for us? And then secondly, what are the health considerations that people need to be thinking about if they want to move to a plant-based diet?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I'd also like to comment on the actual campaign, but just starting with your questions, yeah, it's quite clear that healthy diet patterns, whatever you want to call that type of diet, is one that's centered around whole plant foods, that the foods that promote our health and well-being, both physical and mental, are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, legumes, and nuts and seeds. That's it. And we can live happy, healthy, long lives on such foods without the requirement for meat and dairy or eggs. And that's what the science community is now saying. I mean, Marco will be able to comment because he's been involved in the group, but the Eat Lancet Commission says exactly that. Our diet should be predominantly plant-based for our own personal health, global health, and environmental health together. And so, it's not an either or, choose the environment or your personal health. The food system we need to work towards is aligned, and every major dietetic association is clear that 100% plant-based, if that's what you choose to be, is healthy and can promote health and well-being throughout the life stages. So that's clear and undisputed. And the silver lining, I guess, of the pandemic has been this highlight or light that's been shone on the need to improve the health of the nation. But sadly, like with a lot of criticisms of this current government, their attempts are sort of short-sighted and very superficial. Overweight and obesity is a health outcome. It's not a behavior. It's a health outcome like cardiovascular disease and cancer. And the same root cause of all these chronic illnesses are the ones that are leading to our overweight and obesity. And thinking that a 12-week app will help people reverse, decades of an unhealthy diet that's led to overweight and obesity is wrong. And when you look at the detail of it, it's your very average run-of-the-mill calorie-restricted diet, which we know is completely unsustainable. And as you say, when you read the detail, it doesn't really tell you which are the foods that promote health and which foods are optional. I mean, the only good bit that I found is that there's no red or processed meat on there, and they talk about fiber, but there's recipes with chicken and dairy and eggs and everything. So it's back to that kind of everything in moderation. So for me, it's just not enough. And then behind our backs, then the government are promoting things like consumption of dairy. £1 million have been spent in lockdown on a campaign, and they've even teamed up with the health charity Mind to suggest that drinking milk is good for our mental health, and £1 million of taxpayers' money with the dairy industry. I mean, it's shocking, it really is. And then as much as I know that the economy needs to be supported, eat out to help out. Well, do we really need to go to Nando's for our health and to help out? I mean, promote the correct foods that are going to contribute to our health, whereas this mixed messaging, everyone going out and getting their 2-for-1 offers or whatever it is not going to aid us to lose weight or regain our health, and it's promoting foods that are unnecessary in a healthy food system.
Thank you. Yes, you'd like to comment, Alex?
I can, unless anyone else wants to go. But Nassim, you go first.
Oh, you can go. You go first.
You go. Oh,
I thought I was muted, actually. I guess I wasn't. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much that was very interesting, the situation in the UK. I just want to bring, I know that we're talking about animal agriculture here, but if we're also talking about food systems of the future, I want to add on to, what we're saying about animal foods and animal agriculture and, what's healthy, and bring the focus a bit to the broader food system. So I want to point out that while public health officials don't typically do enough to highlight the fact that we don't need animal foods and so on, this issue of saying, well, to lose weight, just exercise, or, you know, all the ways that messaging kind of falls short, really protect the food industry in a larger sense, and not only the animal food industry. And so, you know, it's also about protecting the interests of Coca-Cola and Nestle and all of these guys. If you tell a population you really don't need Coca-Cola, well, then they lose their profits. And so it's better to tell them walk on a treadmill, because that doesn't, you know, that doesn't impact profits as much. So the issues that we're talking about here in regards to animal foods and animal agriculture, I think that they're very relevant to just what's happened to our food system in general over the past century, which has been a move not only towards more animal food consumption, but also towards more processed foods and just foods that don't have good nutritional value. And so if we're really talking about moving towards a better food system, we need to speak about, you know, if the word capitalism scares us, at least talk about corporate takeover of our food systems and really address that. Because basically in most countries of the world, at least, we have a situation where public health officials don't want to step on the toes of Coca-Cola and all of these guys. It's not only about animal foods. With regard to dairy, I wanted to mention that See the Commons has been talking about school milk for a few years, and we launched a campaign to I live in San Francisco, to get the San Francisco Board of Education to pass a resolution against the mandatory inclusion of school milk in school meals. And so the thing about focusing on dairy here was that dairy is a very good example of how the corporate food system in general kind of makes itself mandatory in people's lives, and the ways that they you know, not only are forced onto people concretely in their day-to-day lives, but also psychologically, the messages that we're given as to how you need this to be healthy. And so for us, one of the important things here is to dismantle those myths and show that actually it's not even a question of, you know, it's not only the access of healthy or unhealthy, it's also this question of necessity. So many of these foods have made themselves necessary in our minds. And I think that reclaiming food systems from corporate control is about dismantling those myths and talking about the foods that we have been eating since forever, that are nutritionally rich, that can actually help us grow healthy bodies and so on.
Yeah, can I go in now? Unless you want to come back to that, Shireen?
No, they're excellent points, and I was speaking before we started that we're also trying to stop, you know, free milk being available in food in schools and necessary, and we've got some media exposure just today on that same issue. It's the mistaken thinking that this is what's going to promote health and is necessary. And I agree, you know, regardless of a meat-based or a plant-based food system, in the UK, more than 50% of what we put in our shopping basket is ultra-processed, not even processed, it's ultra-processed. And that is also degrading our health. So they're really good points made, thank you.
And that 50% figure is like ridiculously triple what it is in most other parts of Europe. We have the highest ultra-processed food consumption in Europe, which is it's just ridiculous when you think about it. And as much as the corporate takeover of our food system has led us in one direction towards meat and dairy, it's also, it's destroyed actually the production in the UK of fruit and vegetables, or particularly vegetables. You know, like we only grow something like, there's only 168,000 hectares of land in the UK given over to fruit, even though it's one of the most obviously nutritionally rich, but also sort of productive things that you can grow. You know, in the 80s, farmers were paid to grub up, i.e. destroy their orchards, you know, because they didn't want them competing in the UK with European imports, mainly Golden Delicious from France, you know. So we've absolutely decimated the industries, the horticulture industry that could feed us the foods that we need. So I think in the UK, we've got a real moment of opportunity, because obviously we've got the National Food Strategy coming in 2021. And there's whatever it comes with, there's going to be an opportunity where food becomes the conversation. You know, so animal liberation organizations, plant-based movements, plant-based organizations have got a real opportunity to sort of leverage that moment and move it in the right direction. And you've got people like the Eating Better Alliance and the Food Ethics Council and the Better Buying Lab from the World Resources Institute in the UK, who are all increasing their input and efforts to have these conversations. And so there's a real moment that will come. And, you know, the National Food Strategy is not going to do what animal liberation or plant-based activists want it to do, but it will at least, we hope, provide a moment for bringing it into a national conversation.
Just a few comments. I think that was great what was all said, and I totally agree with what Shireen laid out there. I mean, there is overwhelming evidence that a plant-based diet is one of the healthiest diets if well composed. And there is also very good observational evidence that people on plant-based diets, when they're not ultra-processed, usually weigh much less. It's usually two BMI points less. So you can literally move from overweight to normal weight if you're on a whole food, more plant-based diet. And such system thinking is really lacking in the national obesity strategy. And also this, what we heard from Nassim, for example, and also Alex to some degree, is this whole obesogenic environment that is around us, that is structured on just having private companies basically making a buck by making people ill, right? And so far, governments have shied away from doing anything that would hurt those private businesses. But I think that's really where civil society needs to step in and really shout around a little bit and say that our health is really more important than money for some industries. And now at the current crisis, we see that actually if health is on the table very clearly and where the association is made much more directly, then actually it seems like governments do take health seriously, right? So why should they not take our health seriously when it's about diet-related diseases that kick in a little bit later? So I guess we need to be much clearer in how imbalanced diets and diets that are ultra-processed and based on animal source foods contribute to personal and population ill health, in addition to planetary ill health.
Okay, thank you all for well, a fantastic summary, basically going across different health-related points. I think we're going back to Marco, actually, for the next question, which is on economics. So it's, do we need some kind of new economic model to enable our food systems to be sustainable? And you've touched on that already, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more. And then the related, maybe coming down to the everyday understanding, is a lot of people say plant-based food is too expensive for people. So is it too expensive, and is that, you know, how does that fit with some kind of new economic model?
Yeah, this is also a very broad question. So,
yeah.
And one thing that I want to maybe pick out here is food prices. In economics, people think that a lot of what we do is hinged on prices, and one can dispute if that is actually true or not. But it seems to be true that when we observe changes in prices, people usually change their behavior, and most of the time it's not conscious. But if you think about yourself, when you go to a supermarket and you see something on offer, you maybe are more likely to buy this if it's fairly similar to what you would buy otherwise, right? The problem with our current food system is that those prices really don't transport transparent information on the health and environmental implications of the foods that we buy. So when we go to a supermarket, we don't see the high climate change price tag of beef there. We don't see the health benefits of fruits and vegetables there, right? So in a well-functioning economic system that actually works to protect the environment and protect health, that information should really be part of food prices. So people who buy foods can see what is relatively encouraged or discouraged, or harming and less harming. And we did some studies calculating how much more expensive, for example, beef need to be. So from a climate change perspective, it should be on average 40% more expensive at least, and that is based on what would now probably be considered a very low price tag of climate damages, right? So depending on what you choose there, it could be much higher. And much more shocking is even the health impact. So if you took seriously the diet-related disease associations like colorectal cancer, stroke, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, if you factored in the health treatment costs into the price of foods, then red and processed meat, for example, in the UK, red meat should be also like 30% more expensive. Processed red meat, more than 100 times more expensive, right? So you literally would pay double for a sausage, for example, right? And you can imagine that people would be less inclined to buy those, especially if then the revenues from such taxation schemes are used for public information campaigns that help people maybe on low food budgets or low income brackets to really shift away from their current consumption pattern. And there used to be a very big argument about the fact that any such price incentives might be financially regressive for people in low income households. But that is really only true if they don't change their consumption patterns. So we did some analysis looking at different dietary patterns and the relative cost of those. And we found that in most middle and high income countries, a more plant-based diet would always be cheaper than current diets. And it's just because animal source foods are usually fairly expensive. So if even people in low-income households are successful in changing to a more plant-based diet, chances are they actually save money. So it's financially progressive if you help them to make that change. And I think there are really clever tax designs or clever financial incentive designs in general need to be thought about, where you have, I don't know, community cooking classes, you provide other kinds of information, and really that are centered on the community level and reinforcing. And I think that way we could slowly get to the idea about what foods should be relatively preferred and less preferred based on our health and economic analyses. Of course, prices are only one thing that we can sort of turn on. And we also find in our analysis, when we look at price incentives, those are usually not enough, right? So I think it's clear that the few examples of where dietary change has happened at the population level were such that a lot of different measures were implemented at the same time. So not only did you have changes in relative prices, you had other types of information campaigns, community-based interventions, all kind of stuff, all at the same time, right? And researchers don't like that usually because they can't say, oh, it's only because of that one thing. But I think that's what we need to think about if we want to think how can people eat healthier and more sustainably. And yeah, nobody has the right answer to this. I think this is a big tent approach and we all need to work towards this.
Thank you, Marco. Yeah, Dawn wants to add something.
Yeah, in terms of the economics, one of the things we focus on at A Well-Fed World and that I did my thesis on was the way in which using animals puts upward pressure on the prices of basic staples. And so where at the global level, we're literally bidding food away from the poorest of the poor to have meat and dairy and animal products for wealthier populations within the country, and then also wealthier countries with it being exported. And actually one of the impetuses for me moving into the nonprofit sector was the famine in the 80s. I was very impacted by and had wanted to work at the World Bank. And then when I was doing the research and realizing that they were actually exporting food during the famine and was just shocked, and then reading more about it and realizing that actually is still common and going on now with the hunger more broadly speaking. And so it's not that if we eat less meat in the US per se, where I'm working out of, that all of a sudden that feeds children in Ethiopia, which is sometimes how things are framed. It's that it keeps the upward pressure on the prices because we're bidding in the global food system. And there's all kinds of factors associated with that. It's not that direct, but it's direct enough. And if we are moving towards a plant-based diet or globally just making massive reductions, there's a 50 by 40 organization that's advocating a 50% reduction. It's an alliance, a network of groups advocating a 50% reduction globally by 2040. That is going to do a tremendous amount for food security. And just in terms of taking pressure off the system, the climate benefits, the natural resource use, and that it's not like a vegan world, as we were saying before. It's not that if there was a vegan world, that doesn't cure hunger. It's not a panacea, but moving in that direction is what we need to take pressure off the system. So we're not going to get massive reductions in world hunger or improvements in food security without reversing the direction on those things in terms of the economic cost. And then I also wanted to the point of subsidies, right? So if we have taxation, that would be amazing. But if we could even just stop the subsidies to the industries and actually have the true cost, and the livestock sector will say, oh, meat's not subsidized because in the US, because it's not direct, but it's through subsidizing the feed and subsidizing the environmental cleanup. If they even had to pay the direct costs and not be subsidized, and then on top of it, would love to have some taxation on the health cost and some taxation that gets redirected, subsidies towards produce and other natural nutrient foods that are plant-based, so that there's all kinds of things. And then of course, bringing in some kind of idea, and I'm not talking about a whole systems overload or overhaul, but maybe I am, that we implementing some kind of food as a right basis, and that people don't have to depend on the price. We don't have to rely on that. At least people's basic needs get met. And then the price issue is more of a scaling up if you want certain items.
Can I get back on this? I think that was excellent. The last approach is really interesting. I mean, you can almost think about how do you implement that in terms of more of a cooperative way of producing and procuring food, right? I wanted to briefly say something about low-income countries, since Dawn, you mentioned that specifically, right? So in that study where we look at the relative cost of different diets, we do find that more plant-based diets are more expensive and will be for some time in low-income countries. But the reason there is really that at the moment, in lots of low-income countries, the diets are very monotonous. So they are based on lots of grain, right? And just a little bit of other things, whatever they can get their hands on. So there the question really becomes, where should those diets evolve to, right? And one can't say that, oh, just because healthy and sustainable diets, if they're more plant-based, they are more expensive there, therefore they shouldn't adopt them. That would be sort of almost a neo-colonial approach in some way. So we analyzed how would it look like in the future? And there we find very clearly that if you factor in the environmental and health costs, or if you look at a future trajectory up to 2050, for example, where incomes are projected to grow, where also diets in low-income countries are projected to change such that they will have more animal source foods. So those three things contribute to the fact that in the long term, for example, in 2050, more plant-based diets that are healthy and sustainable would actually be cheaper in low-income countries. And I think that also needs to be sort of part of the thinking process that, yeah, at the moment in low-income countries, there are really high pressures in terms of dietary change and how that evolves, but it would make much more sense to take an active approach and help them develop a sustainable food system instead of just saying, oh, they must not eat this is more expensive at the moment, right? So I think there just a supportive approach would really pay off. Second, I totally agree with the agricultural subsidy comment you made. At the moment, we are working on a study where we look exactly at that. We look at how many subsidies are directly and indirectly related to animal source foods and foods that are generally not very conducive to healthy and sustainable diets, like sugar, for example, as well, right? And what would happen if we took those subsidies and we actually coupled them to a broad group of fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes? And we do find that if we think we describe the sort of agriculture system well with our models, that the production could be ramped up really, really a lot. And that could really be a contributing factor in moving not only the consumption side, but also the production side towards more sustainable levels, because we also need to talk about that instead of, in addition to talking about changes in consumption. So yeah, great comments.
Richard, can I make a comment here?
Yes, of course you can, Amir. And then Nassim had a hand up as well.
Oh,
so
sorry,
get a comment from her.
Please go ahead, Nassim. No. Yeah, okay. Now, I just wanted to mention that overall, of course, we at the moment we don't really have much connection between land use policy, agricultural policy, or food policy. Especially in the UK, it's just not there. Alex mentioned that we will have food policy proposals next year. The agricultural bill is going through the House of Lords, and that does mention the idea of eating less meat, but it has hardly any mention of the current land use and how odd it is. For example, we import 10 billion pound worth of vegetables, fruits and vegetables from outside, because we produce 15% of what we need. And similarly, we had the 25-year environment strategy last year, and again they talk a great deal about environmental land management, but it's very much geared to the recognition that our industrial agriculture is now polluting and also the global warming elements as well. But it doesn't come up with solutions. For example, the agricultural bill is really already proposed 15% reduction in subsidies. You know, the farmers like milk now is available for 50 cents per liter. I mean, it's just a joke, so heavily subsidized. But of course, much of the taxpayers' money is going to the landed gentry. You know, this sort of 70% of life, but also another 15% of the land which is under arable agriculture is also producing food for livestock industry. So once this whole idea of healthy diet, sustainable food system really catches on, then I think that the debate will begin to open up more and more in terms of economics of the full economics of full cost of production. For example, on the production side, there was nothing on the damage which is caused by, for example, the intensive disturbance of the soil, which of course leads to erosion and land degradation, and absolutely nothing. But a big emphasis on organic production. Now, conventional organic is just as unsustainable. The intensively tilled crop agriculture. So there are a lot of things which will need to be sorted out over the next coming decades to capture all the dimensions of sustainability. But I think what I wanted to point out was that in the agricultural bill, they are already highlighting that there is a need to eat less meat, and but again, the land use is so warped that unless they begin to actually come up with a land use policy which is linked to food policy, environment policy, I think we've still got a big struggle ahead.
Thank you, Amir. And Nassim?
So I don't have anything to add to the comments on the economic aspect. I think that everything everyone said was really interesting, and I agree with it. I just had a couple of things that I wanted to mention in terms of food choices that Marco was speaking a bit about, and add on to that a bit, the reasons that people buy what they buy and eat what they eat. And I think that sometimes when these questions come up, is it too expensive? Is it too privileged? Can people afford it? And so on. There's an assumption that's being made that we're choosing what we eat and buying what we buy purely because of how much it costs, or that's a very significant factor. And within that factor, that it would be, if it's expensive, then, if you don't have money, you don't want to buy it. And if it's not expensive, then that's the thing that obviously you want to buy. And I think that we should question those assumptions as well. I think that other things go into what we're eating. And so if anything, if we look at meat consumption, I think that it points to a different way of making decisions. Worldwide, we're seeing an increase in meat consumption at the moment. And so typically as people move from low income to middle income, as the middle class grows in different countries, what happens is that people start eating more animal products. And so that monotonous diet that Marco was speaking about becomes less monotonous by adding the milk and the meat and the processed foods. And so I think that at a cultural level, generally speaking, of course there are some differences, but I think that at a cultural level, at a psychological level, generally speaking, a lot of what drives meat consumption is classism, is the association of meat with wealth, even still in high-income countries. I think that what I'm saying may be more intuitive when we look at low-income countries. Like my background is Iranian, and it's, in a matter of 2 decades, people just really increased their meat consumption because suddenly they could afford to eat meat more than once a week. But even in high-income countries, in the United States, there's this notion that vegan is the fancy thing, but it's not true. In my neighborhood, there are no fancy vegan restaurants, but you can get a $95 entree with lobster, these sorts of things. So people who are wealthy don't typically celebrate with a bowl of lentils. They celebrate with steak and these sorts of things. So I think that this assumption that if something is perceived as expensive or something of the privilege, that we're not going to want it is not the case. It's typically often the case, and I'm not saying that to defend that. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, just I think that is how it works. And so in that context, I think that we should ask ourselves, maybe it is a good thing if veganism starts to be perceived as something that is more fancy, more more acceptable for the wealthy classes. I don't know if that's the solution, but I think that we need to think about this in a more open way, taking into account the reasons that people are moving away from grain-based diets to eating more animal products. And typically, as they become wealthier, they also change the type of animal products they consume. And so I moved to the US 10 years ago, and what I noticed when I moved here was that there was much more of this discourse than I had heard in Europe, around privilege and wealth and prices, and the poor can't afford to be vegan and so on. So I did hear some of that in Europe, but much, much more in the United States. And I think that one of the things that really impacts this discussion and pretty much every other discussion in the US is US centrism. We basically only look at the situation in the US, and the food system in the US is still pretty unique. Maybe the rest of the world is moving towards that, but where if you're poor, you are more likely to be able to get processed foods as opposed to fresh foods. But another thing in the United States is that culturally, there's a very strong anti-elitist current. That's something that I think is very deep in American culture. And so, there is this thing in the US that if we see the elite as going vegan, then that's something that makes us not want to follow that. And so I think that in this discussion in the animal rights world, we sort of assume that the American mentality exists everywhere. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And even in the United States, I think that sometimes the focus on food deserts, for example, is a little bit misleading. Food deserts do exist in the US where people cannot easily buy, you know, fresh fruits and fresh vegetables and so on. But I think the numbers are smaller than what we tend to assume when we speak about that. And in that discussion, we tend to collapse two different axes, the one of healthy versus unhealthy food, and then the one of animal products versus plant-based products. So, you know, if you go to McDonald's, French fries are also going to be cheap. It's not that, you know, buying French fries that are vegan are going to be super expensive and hamburgers are going to be cheap. So, you know, just to say that that discussion, I think, has been a little bit distorted here, both through US centrism, but also through some, you know, perhaps false assumptions about why people eat what they eat. And perhaps there is actually, in terms of promoting plant-based foods, there is something to be said about, you know, rehabilitating that notion, that long-held notion that if you're poor, you eat, you know, you eat plants. I think still in a lot of the world, if you have guests over and you just serve them vegetarian food, it's kind of shameful. It means you can't afford meat. And so rehabilitating that and making plant-based food into something that actually is, you know, quote, respectful, or you know, something that you would do by choice as opposed to necessity would be good. And then at a much deeper level, and I think this ties into what we were speaking about with the ethics of animal agriculture, you know, this is a long-term project of changing our society, that we shouldn't really be associating meat consumption with, you know, these ideals of wealth and masculinity and so on. But of course, that's a longer project.
Richard, can I just tag off that a little bit?
Of course, yeah.
That's one of the reasons we do focus on high-income countries and middle-income countries also, but not just because we consume the most per capita, but because if we can set that example of shifting towards plant-based diets, then that sets a global example. So, you know, the idea of learning from our mistakes, don't follow what we do. Look at the health cost it's had, look at the environmental cost for these reasons. Again, the US, Europe, UK, Australia, hopefully, you know, start moving towards plant-based and bringing that up as the ideal, and then not importing and exporting, you know, the factory farming and food systems to the lower income countries, but accessing that aspect of it being a status and something that is revered.
Yeah, I think for example, the new Nordic cuisine is a good example of how you create a aspirational diet that is a bit more, that is more plant-based, right? And they really got lots of chefs together to write a manifesto to look where they get food from. And it's not completely plant-based, but it's much more plant-based than the average diet there, right? And they made it a high cuisine, right? So it's like really the aspirational diet for people who have money. And one would hope that there is maybe something similar that goes on not for high cuisines, right? I mean, there surely needs to be both, not only that, but also what sort of the general population eats and what is easy and really tastes good, right? I mean, there is always this problem that when we talk about plant-based menus, if chefs are not trained to cook them, they don't taste good and people don't choose it, right? And that is often what people who don't look for high cuisines look for. Does it taste good, right? Do I wanna buy this? And I think working with chefs, working in with school meals, canteen meals, and sort of more at the higher restaurant level could all be a good way forward of getting tasty, affordable, but also fancy plant-based diets into the public consciousness.
Thank you all. I think we'll go on to the next question now, which will be at first directed towards Dawn, which is a focus on governments and state of agricultural policies around the world. So things seem to be transitioning, but they're not transitioning fast enough. What can we be demanding of our governments? What do we want our governments to do? You've mentioned subsidies already. I just wondered if you could expand on that and other areas.
Yeah, redirecting subsidies, leading with the health first mentality. So for the global good, I was having a thought program kind of consciousness thing with another group recently, and we were talking about, getting rid of food lobbies, for example. So you could still have food advisory boards. I mean, we still want input from the industry and farmers, dietitians, everybody, but not to have it income-based. So pulling some of the power away from it being vested interest, business interest, and leading with the consumers, getting alliances together to the degree we can in terms of health and environment, animals. But yeah, I mean, you got to have the political will. And there's a Navajo saying that you can't wake someone who's pretending to sleep. And so the information is out there. We have it. I mean, one of the things with A Well-Fed World, we don't actually do much original research. It's been out there. It's been out there. You've got the highest levels at the UN, the think tanks, IFPRI, talking about the harms of meat and growing meat consumption globally and per capita, but they won't advocate reduction. And so livestock's long shadow, the 2006 report that kicked off the animal agriculture being responsible for more anthropogenic greenhouse gases than all transportation combined. Of course, we've had other studies kind of coming and going with higher or lower numbers, but even that report that the vegetarian and vegan communities have really leveraged did not advocate reduction. And there's this idea that, how can we reduce the harm but still maintain consumption or allow consumption to grow? How do we meet demand? And that's also what brought me into the nonprofit sector, is because the original report talking about it's called Livestock 2020 back in 1999, outlining all this problems with demand and growth globally, but would not advocate reduction because they said it's demand driven. We have to learn how to meet demand. And so we've got to also work with our politicians, but it has to be systems, right? It can't just be one politician or two at the individual level. We have to be able to get system change for the politicians to be able to follow what's best and not just how to get them reelected.
Yeah, in the UK, I've just spent 6 months talking to food policy organisations and experts, as well as farmers, about what policy they think that we need here. And as you said, Dawn, it's very much about sort of like the political, where is the political will? Because actually, a lot of great ideas are already there. The City University in the UK has a Centre for Food Policy, and Tim Lang is one of the leading professors there. And his new book, Feeding Britain, lays out the call for a food sustainability and sovereignty bill, with a lot of detail there in it. And it just next week, after when this panel will be broadcast, you've got Caroline Lucas, who's going to be introducing the climate and ecological emergency bill to Parliament, which is bringing together a whole bunch of sort of like different actors to say, like, we need to act now. And actually, I think that's going back to Marco's point, civil society can bring forth the chorus of voices from the millions and millions of people around the world who want change, but really it's those who have their hands on the levers of power, particularly legislative power, who need to pull those levers. And it's the policy that we need there has to be a food bill. There have to be food bills because as Amir said, we've got an agriculture bill, we've got an environment bill, which it will be interlinked, but there isn't a food bill. And that comes back to the issue, actually, I think that Dawn mentioned earlier, of food being a right. And food isn't seen as a right. Food is seen as a commodity, and animals are seen as commodities. So we need to rethink what food is through a systems thinking lens. But particularly, we have to see animals always in that lens as well. And because they are at the moment, and that's where we need to take it apart. So I just wanted to sort of like come back to with sort of a question around that, because I know the audience, many of the audience of this will be animal rebellion activists who are going to be out on the streets next week, taking action. And when they're talking about the demands for a food system of the future, a plant-based food system of the future, what's the best piece of evidence that they can go to say, like, this is the reason why we're arguing for it on health, or this is the reason why we're arguing for it on environment, or this is the reason why we're arguing for it in ethics. Because as much as I would like to think the ethical issue would win people over, I really don't think it will as quickly as the health or environmental issue. And that's why Animal Rebellion was set up in many ways. So it's just about sort of, yeah, I like really trying to crystallize this now for people to go, yeah, well, that's the thing that I can go away with and go, right, that's how we're going to win this argument.
I wonder if Shireen could comment on, I know I asked about agricultural policies, but maybe the related health policies and NHS and how we train doctors.
Oh, well, it's sort of related, but I mean, in terms of personal health, I guess we've covered it already. You know, unhealthy diets are now the top cause of illness around the world, and the UK is no different. You know, 1 in 5 deaths is caused by our unhealthy diet. And of course, processed foods come into that, but we're just not eating enough fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, essentially. And that's what is a direct cause of our ill health and our crumbling and financially stretched NHS. And we haven't even touched on causes of new and emerging infections. You know, I'm sure you'll have a different panel on that. But if you bring that into it as well, you know, our health is so related to our food system and our destruction of nature, etc. So I think on a personal level, we can do so much. And you know, from the NHS point of view, we need clear messaging on health promotion. And you know, with the abandonment of Public Health England, I have no idea where this leaves us. I mean, who is now in charge of public health outside of preventing infectious diseases? You know, I don't even know who's taking forward the obesity strategy now that there's no Public Health England. So I'm left rather hopeless, but I think, you know, we can make some personal choices for the health, for our personal health, which is very motivating. And as Marco has already said, you know, we can thrive on a plant-based diet, be the healthiest weight we're meant to be, and try and prevent chronic illness, cardiovascular disease and cancer, which we all fear, but kind of put out to the back of our mind because it's going to happen when we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s and we can deal with it then. Well, it's just not the case. So that's my perspective on the personal health level.
Yeah, I mean, that shows quite strongly that I guess the lip services is cross-departmental, right? So obesity strategy. But I think that is exactly what we need to push for in some ways, right? I mean, we need to hold the politicians to account now to really make health and sustainability policy truly cross-departmental, which it never has been, right? I mean, what they do with agriculture policy doesn't measure up with what they do in health policy and so on. It's just a disaster, right? But I think there is now lip service to say that they would do it differently. So we really need to observe that well and call them to account there. On the production side, there is this mantra of public money for public goods, right? Public goods don't include just producing more of environmentally and health harmful products, right? So that needs to be called out. And same when cross-departmental health in all sectors policy also is really not coming to fruition. We calculated that if the UK were successful in helping people to move towards more plant-based diets with very standard ways of monetizing that would actually be associated with double the budget, the NHS budget, double the total budget. That is how much you would value such a something like that, just based on avoided deaths, right? So it should be clearly one of the most important things to move people to a healthier diet, just based on very standard cost-benefit analysis. Yet politicians shy away from this, right? So we can only rub it in more and more, I guess. Yeah.
So one of the things I would have liked to have mentioned when I was doing the spiel earlier is that policies also need to represent what is actually ideal. So a lot of times in government policies, they will adjust far downward the recommendation based on what they expect the population will do. And so if we can even just get clear goals, so not say exercise 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week, but an hour a day, 7 days a week is really much more, which is what's needed. That's what would be recommended, probably even more than that. Same with getting fat down, sugar down, all of those types of things. I think they do a little bit better of a job on fruits and vegetables, 9 a day, but that was 5 a day before, and maybe it should be more like 15 a day. I don't know, but yeah, if we can just get clear recommendations on what actually should be, not watered down and diluted based on what we think we can get.
Yeah, I think that also shines a light on the fact that we really don't have science-based policies at all, right? I mean, we have commissions on stuff, but those commissions are headed by not independent heads. So really calling for more science-based policies that take a system perspective is also very important there, because you can't really imagine basically, for example, having new food-based dietary guidelines not in line with also highlighting the benefits of plant-based diets if they were science-based, right? So I think we don't need to shout around with moralistic arguments. We can just say, look at the science and really do what science puts out over and over.
The U.S. dietary guidelines, I was going to some of the meetings and was shocked at some of the considerations they make. So they don't want to bias any foods against the others. So they would not say spinach is better than French fries or potato chips. And they also were motivated by considerations such as publications. So it's published every 5 years, and books publish the graphs and the recommendations. And there's a lot of pressure from publishers and school systems and across the board not to change the recommendations, because they would have to update their publications. So lots of considerations.
Thank you very much, everybody. So the final question is about the future. What are the barriers? What are the key barriers and opportunities we can identify to push for a sustainable food system?
So it's me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Okay, that's not, so at an agricultural level, I think that we all agree that what we want is plant-based agriculture. Before getting into how to get there, which I don't have, the answers for really, I just want to mention, what do we mean by plant-based agriculture, or I would say veganic agriculture. So I use the term veganic really to describe a very broad range of practices. Veganic is not one type of agriculture. Veganic just means vegan organic. And so that would mean that you're not exploiting animals, you're not farming animals, you don't have animals as property on your farm, you're not using their inputs such as manure or blood meal or so on, you're not exploiting them for labor, which is perhaps less common in high-income countries, but still common around the world. And so that would be veganic. But within that, I mean, veganic can really mean so many things in the same way that organic can mean so many things. And so, my background is not at all in agronomy or anything like that. So I don't go out and say, well, this is the model that we need. I leave that to others. And the others that typically I want to listen to and build platforms for and put their voices forth are, for the most part, farmers. I think that academics and others do have a big role to play, but I think that those who need to be front and forward are the farmers who are on the ground. And so, when we speak about veganic farming, when we started talking about veganics, it was not as sort of the solution to our problems in terms of health or environment. I know that that's not really, the panel would like it to be in that sense, but for the comments, it wasn't that. It was more that to address the problems that we have, not only in our food system, but in our world at large, environmental problems, health problems, but also human rights issues, social justice issues, we need to change our food system. And part of that is doing away with industrial agriculture and replacing it with ecological agriculture, I would say agroecology, But the only people who were speaking about doing that, or at least who were really, you know, had their voices somewhat a little bit heard, you know, there were a few veganic people here and there. The only people who were speaking about doing that were putting forth models that exploited animals. And so agroecology means, you know, you have a few chickens, you have a few, you know, cows or whatever. Permaculture necessarily means you have the ducks or the bees or so on. And now there's this, you know, the focus on regenerative grazing. It's become that the idea has become that we absolutely need cows to save the world. And so for Seed the Commons, it was not we need veganics to save the world. It was we need a transition to ecological farming. And because we're animal liberationists, we do that within our ethical framework. And so that means that agroecology is vegan agroecology, permaculture is vegan permaculture, and even regenerative farming is vegan regenerative farming. And so personally, because I don't feel like I know enough, I'm not going to get into a discussion on whether or not we should have systems that are based on grains, you know, annuals, or whether, you know, we really should be having, you know, systems that are more in line with what regenerative people are saying, which would be less grain-based, more trees, etc. Instead, it's that whatever it is that we're talking about, it's going to be a vegan version of those things, and I'll put forth the voices of different farmers who have different approaches, as long as they're within those parameters. So, you know, how do we get there? That could be a whole panel or more than a whole panel. I think there's the policy level, there's the cultural level, there's so many levels to this discussion, and then, you know, activism and organizing at local levels, at national levels, and at international levels at the same time. All of that plays its part, and I think different tactics play its part. But the one thing that I would say is that we do need, in terms of leading the vision of what it is that we're working towards, you know, generally speaking, this needs to be led by genuine grassroots movements in terms of effectuating change, and then in terms of the specifics of what do we want to grow? What do we want to replace industrial farming with? We need to be listening to farmers, not only veganic farmers, actually. I mean, we still need to be listening to the farmers who have been doing most of this work at an international level. For example, Via Campesina, you know, these sorts of people who are speaking about agroecology. We need to be listening to them and then seeing how can we apply this within an animal liberationist perspective, and also lift up the voices of veganic farmers who, you know, like Seed the Commons goes to local environmental group, conferences and so on, and we're the only ones there speaking about veganics. And sometimes you do have farmers who are there, who are veganic farmers, who give presentations that everyone admires, and nobody knows that they're listening to a veganic farmer. So it's completely invisible in those circles. So I think that that vision needs to be led by them and not by, you know, dudes in Silicon Valley who want to be like the guy who found out the thing that saved the world. And yes, I do think that academics and the FAO and all of these guys have a big part to play, but working with and being informed by the grassroots and by small scale farmers who have, you know, a genuinely ecological perspective. And so, you know, I don't know if you guys can see behind me, but like in San Francisco now, we basically don't have clean air. There are wildfires all around us. And so we can't go out. It's full of smoke. That's the direct effect of climate change. And at the same time, in San Francisco, we have an environmental movement. We have food activists who are really pushing this notion that the alternative that we need to have to an industrial food system, to industrial agriculture, is one that's based on cows and so on. You know, they're still promoting local organic dairy farms, whereas right at this moment, native animals are being killed on the dairy farms because they don't have access to water. The water's all going to the cows. So, you know, yes, we need to listen to the grassroots, including farmers who are not vegan, but we still need to also critique the grassroots. There's work that needs to be done not only at a policy and organizing level, but also at a cultural, psychological, societal level to see what, you know, what are the barriers here of making a change in how we treat animals. And then, I mean, I don't know if I have, you know, a bit of time, but like, I'll just say that I wrote a chapter for Dr. Kassam's book in which I spoke about the importance of grassroots movement and leading change. And literally the day after I submitted the last changes for publication, I told myself this is really silly, because I felt like I had written a thing where I was like, we need to follow the grassroots and blah, blah. And it's as if I'd said, well, everybody just needs to be happy all the time. And, we can say that, but there are barriers to it. There are reasons that that doesn't happen. And so something that I've really been learning a lot about from both our experiences, but also the experiences of, other people who work in other areas, not only food systems, but, other social justice areas and so on, is that, there's a reason we don't usually hear from the grassroots. They don't have the money, and even within the nonprofit world, the work of grassroots is typically exploited, co-opted, watered down. We have a nonprofit industrial complex with funders who do not want to hear about capitalism and so on. They want, small token actions. And so, it doesn't stop at saying we need civil society to stand up and grassroots solutions and farmers and so on, but that's sort of the beginning of analyzing, why does the message get lost? Why does the message of grassroots groups get co-opted and watered down? So that's not so much a solution. It's more like a problem we need to be aware of and work on going forward.
Amazing, thank you very much. I'm aware Alex is about to get locked out of the building.
Locked in.
Sorry?
Yeah, locked in, yeah.
Yeah, lock in.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we, thank you very much, Nassim. Is it okay if we now close and give some kind of takeaway sentences each, and I'll ask Alex to start with that. Is that okay? Yeah,
okay.
So I'll just say thank you very much for a fantastic discussion. It's been amazing. Lots learnt, and if you could all just give a sentence or two for those listening to listen to take away. And Alex, if you could begin, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Animal Rebellion Bristol, for organising this. It's been really insightful and brilliant to listen to. It's great for all of us to get together and sort of like share all of this knowledge. And what I really want to see us all do is really work together in terms of creating those visions of answering these questions that we've all raised, saying, yeah, this is the vegan version of the food system that we want, and using our imaginations and using the research and using our sort of voices and obviously centering those voices that have been previously marginalized to create that vision, because actually that's what I think we really need going forward. So, and I think Animal Rebellion has actually been central to that, certainly in the UK and globally, of having that conversation start from grassroots activists going forward. So thank you, and thank you everyone.
Amir, would you like to go next?
Yes, I enjoyed listening to Nassim just now. I agree with most things she said. With the book which we edited, we come out eventually that the vision framework has to be one of inclusive responsibility, so that we begin to move this forward at all levels. But at the practical level, given what's already in train, agroecology is essentially the organic agriculture with the political dimensions, which are really good in terms of food sovereignty, land justice, localization, and all those things are very important moving forward, because at the moment, of course, those are the kinds of things which are removed away by the corporate model, and that keeps marginalizing land users and smallholders and so forth. But in terms of the actual production part, of course, conventional organic farming is just as unstable, unsustainable, and it is heavily reliant on the livestock part. So Nassim's mention of veganic agriculture is a very correct one, and of course the third missing part at the moment on the production side is this industrial intensive agriculture, which we can now basically reverse altogether in terms of what we are calling conservation agriculture, which can be practiced at any level, but especially it's a very pro-poor, pro-development oriented agriculture, which is based on no-till, underpinning the production system ecologically and biologically, which again Nassim referred to. So we come out more or less with what Nassim tried to capture, and fortunately I think the forces are converging, but the idea that farming basically does not need animal is going to be hard to get accepted. And of course, on the health side, that it's plant-based, which gives you the best quality of life and ethically as well as environmentally. So I think the pieces are now there. Different groups who are engaged need to be moved forward, and in terms of the policymakers, I think that they often have to react when the ground is swelling and showing. I'll give you a good example here in the UK. There's no policy on the kind of agriculture paradigm or the type of arable plant-based farming. But farmers are now basically realizing that what they're doing is destroying their own farm, the value of the very natural resource base they're owning. And there is a great move forward by farmers-led. Via Campesina will take longer because it's made up of 1 billion households. 1 billion people, 2.25 billion households. A lot of them are very poor people, and some of them, their livelihood is tied to animals. But even there, one can show to them that livestock is not an essential component if they farm differently, and that you could cycle nutrients differently. You can bring forward your sort of create manure through earthworms. It doesn't need a cow. So there are lots of positive things which are already available. And this book concludes that really the biggest challenge now is the great ignorance everywhere about the plant-based diet and about the so-called new agriculture paradigm, which is moving forward very nicely. 15% of the global land area, arable area, is now already under new agriculture, which is very sustainable, very environmentally sound, doesn't need animals.
Thank you very much, Amir. Just to say, Alex had to run as he was about to get locked out of his building, but he says thank you very much. Dawn, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Yeah, about 20 years ago, I was being interviewed for Meat Out with the pork industry in a newspaper, and he was like, do you really think the vegetarians are going to knock out meat consumption? And I was like, no, actually, I think you all are going to take yourselves out. And I still hold that to be true, that animal agribusiness is its own worst enemy. They're pushing the earth, the land, the air, the pollution, and now, climate is much more prominent than it was 20 years ago in terms of the forces at work. And they're reliant on taking up an unfair share of global resources, and those resources will become increasingly scarce, not just for population pressure reasons, but for the ways in which climate destruction, both in terms of natural disasters, and then of course the changing soils and temperatures being hit from all these different directions. And so that animal agriculture is its own worst enemy. Now the thing is, it's on the timeline is increasingly fast, but it's also slow. And so are we going to take out, how much of humanity are we going to take out with or before animal agriculture is significantly undermined? So if we could be proactive, and solution oriented and stay ahead and not be pushed by natural disasters and resource scarcity. You know, that would be ideal. And unfortunately, humans haven't seemed to operate that way. We're just in crisis. And, you know, the pandemic now is putting some pressure on. Will that be enough? Maybe combined with everything? I don't know. It's going to have to be forced on us, I'm afraid. But in the long term, animal agriculture won't be able to sustain itself.
Thank you, Dawn. Hopefully we can speed the transition up, but yes. Nassim, would you like to give some closing remarks?
Sure. So if we want to liberate animals and we want to end animal agriculture, as you know, the animal rights, the animal liberation movement has been doing, we need to have an alternative to propose. I think that with a few exceptions, for the most part, the animal rights movement has been saying, we don't want this, but we haven't been showing what do we want. We've been doing that with food. We've been sharing our recipes and opening restaurants, but it's not enough to focus on what's on our plates. We have to focus on what's going on in the fields, because even, you know, if you just buy vegan food, that vegan food is being produced with animal manures and so on, and is tied into, you know, economically tied into industrial animal agriculture typically. So it's important that we put forth an alternative right now, that we say this is the world that we envision after we've achieved animal liberation. We actually have a proposal and this is what it's going to look like. And it's especially important that we put forth that vision in the current context, which is that the other people who are speaking about food systems and who are speaking about the environment have increasingly been saying that the only way to do ecological farming, to do sustainability, is by exploiting animals, is by grazing cows and so on. So in that context, it's especially important that we say, no, there actually is an alternative, and that isn't true. So, you know, Seed the Commons, the organization that I founded, we did not start out with, you know, the message that veganic is better. It was more that veganic is doable. We can do agroecology, we can do regenerative farming, we can do permaculture, and all these awesome things that other people are talking about. We actually can do them without the, you know, the component of the domesticated animal. It's possible to do it veganic, and therefore there's no excuse to not go along with our ethics. You know, there's no necessity there that sort of dismantles the argument for ethics. Having said that, even though we didn't start with that message, it did become clear that if you take one method and you say, well, these are the benefits, right? You know, when you move away from industrial farming towards an ecological model that's closed loop, you're going to use less resources, you're going to degenerate the soil less, you're going to protect biodiversity. These are all things that happen when you move from industrial to ecological farming. And then, you know, we saw, well, if you do that, and then on top of that, you take out the domesticated animals, well, it's even better. You're actually using less resources. You're less in competition with the native biodiversity. If the idea is that you want to be disconnected from the corporate food system and not rely on fossil fuels and so on, well, now you're doing that even more so, because you're not, you know, buying manures from other farms that are having these practices. And so veganic really appears like the next logical step. You know, the idea that we should move towards ecological farming, even if we didn't care about animals, I think it does, at least in most cases, naturally lead us to veganic farming. And one time I was interviewing a veganic farmer she had started out as a sort of conventional organic farmer, so to speak. And then she moved on to a more ecological based style of farming towards agroecology. And then she did that for a while. And then later she had an epiphany and went vegan. And so she adapted her system to not having any farm animals. And she says that in her mind, these are actually the 3 stages of organic. And this is ideally the movement that we're going to see everyone do. So I hope that that's the case.
Thank you very much, Nassim. Shireen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I guess just to your AR audience and hopefully some health professionals in the audience, that really 100% plant-based diet can promote health and well-being throughout the life stages. And if anyone wants to plant seeds of doubt, be reassured that there are ulterior motives and you can fully promote your health on a plant-based diet. And as health professionals, we need to demand that plant-based foods, healthy foods, are accessible and affordable to all communities here in the UK and around the globe.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, Marco, for some closing statement.
Yeah, I would just call for, let's continue working on a great food transformation that addresses all what is wrong with the different stages of the food system, including unsustainable food production, unhealthy food consumption, and unequitable food processing. That needs policies and approaches across the sectors, across government departments. And I think what is underlying very often the things that go wrong is that private interests are not aligned with public interests. So let's fight for progressive regulation that makes sure that that is aligned. And that can include full pricing, realignment of agricultural subsidies, agroecological approaches, health promotion campaigns, and many more. Let's work together on this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's it then. Thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to all those listening as well. Take care.